Night shift in the trauma bay. The monitors keep their steady tone like metronomes. The air smells of antiseptic and hot plastic. A gurney slams through the ER doors. Blood on the sheet. A man in a torn uniform jacket, face gray, jaw clenched like he is refusing to fall apart. Two armed men follow too close behind, not hospital security, too disciplined, too quiet. Get the float, nurse, a physician says without looking up. It is not a request. It is dismissal. The float nurse steps in anyway. Plain scrubs, badge flipped backward from too many rotations. No one knows his name. No one asks. The armed men scan the room like they own it. The doctors keep talking over the nurse as if he is furniture. Then the patient's hand moves, slow, deliberate, toward a dark beret pinned under his shoulder strap. And the float nurse's eyes lift, just once, with recognition that does not belong in a hospital. No one sees it. Not yet. But in the next few minutes, everyone in that room is going to learn they judged the wrong person. The hospital at night did not feel like a place that saved people. It felt like a machine that refused to stop. Fluorescent lights hummed above polished floors. The air carried bleach, warmed plastic, and something metallic that never fully left the vents. Behind the double doors, alarms rose and fell like distant sirens. Monitors, pumps, called bells, each one demanding to be answered before it became something worse. He moved through it without hurry. Not slow, not rushed, measured. His badge swung against his chest as he walked, half hidden by the fold of his scrub top, the clip worn down and smooth from being yanked off and reattached in too many units. Float pool was printed under his name in small letters that made people stop reading early. In the trauma corridor, an attending physician stepped out of a room with his sleeves rolled above the elbows, hands wet from scrubbing, eyes already looking past him. Float, the doctor said, not as a name. Go cover Pod C and find out why radiology is sitting on my CT reads. The nurse nodded once. Yes, doctor. No argument. No explanation that Pod C already had 2 nurses short and 1 traveler who could not find the medication room without being escorted. No mention that radiology had 1 overnight resident and a backlog that would eat itself alive until morning. He just turned and went. That was the thing about floating. You did not own any space long enough to be defended. You arrived where the cracks were widening, and you held them with your hands until the next person arrived to pretend it had always been fine. At the charge desk, the unit clerk glanced up, eyes tired, mouth set. You're back again, she said, not unkindly. What do you need me? He asked. She slid a paper assignment sheet toward him. His name had been written in pen at the bottom, squeezed between 2 rooms and a hallway bed. A late edition, a spare part. Before he touched the paper, he looked at the board. Room numbers, names, acuity, isolation status. He did not stare. He absorbed it like a habit. Then he picked up the sheet and walked into Pod C. Inside, a new nurse struggled with a 4 pump, fingers shaking while the screen chirped an error tone. The patient watched her with wide eyes, oxygen cannula sitting crooked on his face. The man's wife hovered behind the curtain, wringing a tissue into knots. The nurse's voice was too bright. It's just, the pump is being weird. He stepped beside her without announcing himself. He did not reach over her hands. He waited until she looked at him. Then he pointed at the clamp on the tubing. It's closed, he said quietly. She blinked, then opened it. The pump stopped screaming. The medication began to flow. Her shoulders sagged with relief, so sharp it almost looked like pain. Thank you, she whispered. He nodded once, as if it had not mattered. He checked the patient's vitals on the monitor without making a show of it, adjusted the cannula so it sat correctly, and pulled the blanket up to the man's chest. Small fixes, invisible fixes, the kind that kept people alive without creating any story about it. At the next room, a respiratory therapist pushed past him with a portable ventilator. Trauma activation coming, she said, already moving. Level 1, 2 minutes. He paused at the edge of the corridor, listening. You could tell a lot from how a unit changed before something arrived. Phones stopped ringing because someone had finally answered them. Footsteps sharpened. Voices got tighter. Supplies were grabbed without being asked for. People glanced toward the ambulance entrance the way animals watched a tree lean. The overhead speaker crackled. Trauma team to Bay 1. Trauma team to Bay 1. He turned toward the trauma bay, walking at the same measured pace. Around him, staff moved faster, adrenaline visible on their faces like sweat. A resident jogged by carrying a clipboard. "Hey, are you assigned to trauma?" He did not answer with emotion. "Where do you need me?" The resident hesitated, then pointed. "Bay 1. We're short." He nodded and kept moving. At the trauma doors, 2 security officers stood uncertainly, hands near their belts. One of them leaned closer to the other. "They said they're armed escorts," he murmured. The nurse's eyes flicked once to their posture, to the way they were standing with weight back instead of forward, hesitant to commit. He did not correct them. He just passed between them and pushed into the bay. Bay 1 was ready the way a battlefield was ready. Organized chaos, tools laid out with grim precision. Trauma shears, suction, intubation kit, chest tube tray. The crash cart parked at an angle that made it easy to reach but hard to tip. A physician stood at the foot of the bed, gloved hands flexing. Another doctor adjusted the overhead light. "Where's my trauma nurse?" The attending snapped. A tech pointed toward the doorway. "We got float." The attending's gaze landed on him for half a second. Scrubs, simple badge, no department ownership, and slid away like he had already been weighed and dismissed. "Fine," the physician said. "Just stay out of the way unless someone tells you otherwise." He stepped to the side of the bed and became exactly what they expected: quiet, still, available. The doors burst open. The gurney came in hard, wheels rattling. The patient on it was a man in a torn uniform jacket, soaked through at the left side. He did not thrash. He did not cry out. His face was gray, lips pale, eyes open and fixed on nothing. 2 men followed close, too close for family, too close for ordinary security. Their hair was cut short. Their eyes were alert. They scanned the bay in clean arcs, checking corners, checking faces, checking exits. They did not speak to the doctors first. They watched the room like it was hostile territory. "Name?" the resident demanded, leaning over the patient. One of the escorts answered. "No name. Priority patient. You keep him alive." "That is not how this works," the attending said, sharp. The escort's gaze did not change. "It is tonight." The nurse stood with his hands relaxed at his sides. He watched the man's breathing, shallow, controlled, like he was holding himself together with discipline instead of muscle. He watched the blood seep through the sheet, dark and steady. He watched the escorts. Their hands stayed visible. Their bodies stayed between the gurney and the doorway. Not panicked, not posturing, professional. The physician lifted his chin at the nurse without looking at him fully. "Float, start a second line, and do not waste time." He moved in. He did not rush. He did not fumble. He prepped the skin, found a vein on the first pass, secured the catheter cleanly, taped it down with a calm economy that made the new nurse from Pod C stop in the doorway and stare. As he worked, the patient's hand shifted weakly, sliding toward his shoulder strap. Something dark was pinned there, half hidden beneath the torn fabric. A beret. The patient's fingers curled around it, as if it mattered more than the pain. The nurse's eyes lifted just once, and something in his expression changed, so small it could have been missed as a blink. Recognition. Not surprise. Recognition like confirmation. He leaned in closer, voice low enough that no one else could claim they heard it. "Hold on," he said, simple as a clinical instruction. The patient's eyes flickered toward him. For the first time since the doors opened, the man seemed to truly see someone in the room. Then the monitor tone dipped, and the trauma bay surged into motion. And nobody noticed that the float nurse had already begun counting exits. The trauma bay tightened around the gurney the way a room did when something dangerous entered it. Quiet hands moving fast, voices clipped, eyes avoiding the wrong faces. "Pressure's dropping," the resident said. "2 units O negative," someone called. The attending leaned over the patient's chest, listening, then looked up at the escorts. "Step back. Now." Neither man moved. Not defiance, not aggression, just an absence of compliance, like the request belonged to a different world. Hospital security shifted near the door, unsure who they were supposed to control. The charge nurse took a half step forward, then stopped. She had seen enough to know when a situation had legal weight attached to it, even if the paperwork had not arrived. The float nurse stayed at the patient's right side, hand steady at the foresight, watching blood return, watching the line hold. One escort finally spoke. "We need privacy." The attending's eyes hardened. "This is a trauma bay. You get what you get." The escort's gaze slid across the staff, faces, badges, positions, then settled on the ceiling corners as if mapping cameras. The nurse followed that glance without turning his head too far. He counted the cameras too, not because he distrusted the hospital, because he distrusted anyone who cared whether the cameras were there. The patient's breathing stayed shallow. He was conscious in the strictest sense, eyes open, body obeying discipline, but he was not present. Shock had taken the part of him that spoke. "Fast exam," the attending ordered. The ultrasound tech rolled in, gel already open, procord looped over his wrist. As the probe pressed into the patient's abdomen, the float nurse watched the man's jaw tighten. Pain contained, not expressed. A physician would read that as toughness. The nurse read it as training. "Fluid," the ultrasound tech said, voice low. "Free fluid." The resident swallowed. "Internal bleed." "Or isn't ready," someone said from the doorway. "They're finishing a case." The attending cursed under his breath and snapped toward the charge nurse. "Call them again." The charge nurse already had the phone at her ear. She frowned, pulled it away, looked at the screen like it had betrayed her. Tried again. Nothing. No ringtone. No busy signal. Just dead air. She held the receiver out, as if someone else might fix it by touching it. "That is not possible." "Use your cell," the attending said. The charge nurse did. Her face changed in small increments. Confusion first, then irritation, then something closer to concern. "No service," she said, and it came out quieter than she meant. In an urban hospital, in a reinforced building full of antennas and repeaters, losing service did not happen by accident. The float nurse did not react outwardly. He kept his fingers on the patient's wrist, counting a pulse that was trying to run away. He watched the doors. A respiratory therapist pushed in, bag valve mask ready. "His sats are falling." "Get me intubation," the attending said. A nurse reached toward the airway cart and found it already open, drawers pulled, blades arranged. She hesitated, then looked at the float nurse like she was surprised to see it prepared. He had not announced that he had checked it. He had simply done it while everyone else was focused on the bleeding. Quiet competence. No credit. One of the escorts leaned toward the patient's head and spoke, low and tight. "Sir, stay with me." The float nurse caught it. The choice of address. Not buddy, not man, not even a name. "Sir." The attending noticed too, but dismissed it the way doctors dismissed anything that did not fit their immediate model of a patient. "Tell me who he is," the attending demanded. "Allergies? Meds? Anything." The escort's jaw worked once. "None you need." The attending's voice rose. "That is not acceptable." A loud, sharp sound cut through the bay. Not a gunshot. A metal latch slamming. Everyone turned. The trauma bay doors, the ones designed to swing freely for emergencies, had been secured. Not locked with a key, secured with a manual floor bolt that maintenance used during construction and then forgot existed. Hospital security stared at it like it had appeared out of nowhere. "Who did that?" the charge nurse asked. No one answered. The float nurse looked at the escorts. They were watching the hallway through the narrow window panel, shoulders angled, feet placed like they expected force to come through. The nurse understood then. The escorts did not come to keep people out. They came because someone was coming in. A unit clerk appeared at the doorway, face pale. "There are men at the front desk asking for Trauma Bay 1, she said. "They have badges. They are not hospital." The attending snapped. "What kind of badges?" The clerk shook her head, frantic. "Federal, I think." Hospital security finally moved, palms up in a calming gesture. "Everyone needs to relax. We'll handle." The escort cut him off without raising his voice. "You will not." That was the first open assertion of authority. It landed in the room like a weight. The float nurse kept his hands on the four-line, but his attention widened doors, windows, angles, distances. the crash cart's position, the suction canister's plastic lid, the portable oxygen tank chained to the wall. Objects became options. The patient's fingers twitched again toward his shoulder strap, brushing the edge of that dark beret as if anchoring himself to it. The float nurse leaned close, not dramatic, not intimate, just efficient like checking breath sounds. "You are not safe here," he murmured, so low it could have been mistaken for clinical reassurance. The patient's eyes slid toward him, unfocused, then sharpened for a fraction of a second. The escort nearest the nurse noticed that glance. His posture changed, minute but real, like a man realizing someone else in the room understood the language of threat. Outside the bay, footsteps gathered, not running, coordinated, heavy enough to be deliberate. The attending raised his voice to reassert control. "Listen to me. We're taking him to surgery as soon as they—" The float nurse watched the door bolt, watched the narrow glass panel, watched the reflection of movement on the polished floor. Then he spoke, still calm, still unclaimed. "We need a clean route," he said. The attending turned on him, irritated. "We need an or." The float nurse did not argue. He simply met the attending's eyes for the first time, steady, unreadable. "A clean route first," he repeated, and in that moment, the room felt the shift, even if nobody understood it yet. Because the float nurse was not asking for permission. He was warning them. Outside the trauma bay, the hallway noise changed. Not louder, more controlled. Footsteps fell in a cadence that did not belong to visitors or nurses or even hospital security. No heridos shuffling, no uncertain stops. It sounded like people who had already decided where they were going. The float nurse stood near the head of the bed, one hand on the fore pump, the other resting lightly on the rail, casual, non-threatening. His eyes stayed on the door window. In the reflection, movement crossed the polished floor in straight lines. The attending did what physicians did when their world felt challenged. He raised his voice and tried to make the room obey. "Focus," he snapped. "We have a hypotensive trauma. Ultrasound positive. We need blood running, and we're on standby." The charge nurse tried again with her cell. She stepped closer to the wall, as if proximity to a building could conjure signal. "Nothing," a resident murmured. "Maybe the network is down." The float nurse did not answer. The hospital's internal Wi-Fi was still up. The monitors still transmitted. The fore pump still connected. Selective silence was not a network issue. It was intent. The escort nearest the door pressed his fingertips to the seam of his earpiece, listening to something no one else could hear. His face stayed blank. The other escort checked the patient's straps, tightening them, not for safety, for control. Then, from the corridor, a voice cut through. "Hospital security. Open the doors." It was loud enough to be heard, calm enough to feel rehearsed. Hospital security, on the inside, looked at each other. One officer shifted his weight, hand hovering near his radio like it might suddenly work. The charge nurse turned to the attending. "That is not our voice." "Open," the voice demanded again. "This is a federal matter." The attending's chin lifted. "Federal? In my trauma bay." He stepped toward the door with the authority of a man used to being obeyed. The float nurse moved with him, not blocking, not leading, just near enough to catch a mistake before it became irreversible. The attending leaned to the glass panel. "Identify yourselves." A badge rose into view, pressed against the window. A flash of gold. Letters too small to read through glare and adrenaline. The man behind the badge spoke evenly. "We are here for the patient brought in minutes ago. You will release him into our custody immediately. This is lawful order." The attending glanced to the escort inside the bay. "Is that true?" The escort did not blink. "No." The attending exhaled sharply, anger and uncertainty colliding. "Then who the hell are you?" The escort finally gave something away. Not words, but the way his shoulders held. A quiet readiness, like he had been waiting for this moment and hated that it had arrived in a hospital. "People trying to take him," he said. "They're not the ones you should be listening to." The voice outside returned, stronger. "Open the door. We have authorization. We have paperwork." A paper slid into the narrow gap beneath the door, an attempt at legitimacy. The sheet stopped short against the bolt. The float nurse looked at it without bending down. He looked at the edges. Clean, uncreased. It had been printed recently. Carried carefully. Prepared for a performance, not a rush. He spoke softly to the charge nurse. Do not touch it. She looked at him, startled. What? He did not repeat himself. He didn't need to. His tone carried the weight of certainty, and she obeyed without fully understanding why. The attending, however, was still trying to fight with rules. We have a dying patient, he called through the door. If you have legal concerns, you can speak to administration. A pause. Then the answer came, flat and cold. Administration has been notified. Open the door. The float nurse felt it. Someone outside was already controlling channels that should not be controllable. The escort inside touched his earpiece again. Still listening. Still receiving nothing that could be shared. The patient on the gurney shifted. A small sound escaped him, not a moan, something closer to breath catching around pain. His fingers slid again toward the dark beret pinned near his shoulder. He dragged it closer to his chest like it was a last remaining piece of order. The float nurse watched his hand, then his face. Training showed itself in what a man clung to when he was losing blood. Not a phone, not a wallet, not a ring, a symbol. The door handle rattled hard. Hospital security on the inside stiffened. Hey, one officer called. You cannot. The handle rattled again, stronger like someone testing the hardware and measuring how much force would be required to break it. The attending swore and turned to the escorts. Tell your people to stand down. You are endangering staff. The escort's eyes cut to him. Those are not our people. Silence fell for half a second. The kind of silence where everyone's body realized the same truth at the same time. This was not a misunderstanding at the front desk. This was a targeted retrieval. A nurse near the supply cart whispered, "This is insane." The float nurse's eyes moved across the bay. Staff positions, lines, sharp instruments, oxygen tanks, glass, metal corners. He saw what could become weapons if panic took over, and he saw how quickly panic could be lit. He kept his voice low and calm. We need to move him. The attending snapped. To where? Or isn't ready. Not, or. The float nurse replied. The escort turned his head slightly, as if hearing the nurse for the first time. Where then? The float nurse did not explain like a lecturer. He pointed with his chin toward the ceiling corner near the door. Camera coverage, he said. Blind spots. Hallway angles. The attending stared at him. What are you talking about? The float nurse met his eyes again, steady, restrained, no emotion given away. This room is a trap. Outside, the voice rose, now impatient. Last warning. Open the door, or we open it for you. The float nurse leaned toward the charge nurse, quiet enough to avoid spreading fear. Call a code silver, he said. The charge nurse swallowed. We do not call that. We do tonight, he answered. The escort inside the bay watched him, expression tightening, not surprise but recognition. The kind that comes when you realize the quiet person in the corner knows the same procedures you do in a different world. The door handle rattled again, followed by a dull impact, someone shouldering it, testing. The patient's eyes opened wider, clarity breaking through shock for an instant. He looked at the float nurse, then at the door. His lips moved, barely forming sound. The float nurse leaned closer. Commander, the patient breathed, so faint it could have been air escaping. The word hit the room, even if nobody heard it clearly. The escorts did. Their hands shifted, bodies tightening into protective geometry. The attending heard something in it too, even if he did not know what. His face paled. Outside, metal scraped. They were bringing tools. The float nurse's hand stayed on the rails, calm. But his mind was already moving ahead. Routes, timing, staff safety, patient survival. The crisis had not changed. It had arrived, the trauma. Bay held its breath. Another impact hit the door, measured, not frantic. The bolt trembled in its housing, a dull vibration traveling through the floor. The window panel flashed a shadow, then a shoulder, then nothing. The attending snapped. Everyone stay focused. Nobody opens that door. He said it like his words could control the hallway. The float nurse watched the escorts. They had stopped pretending they were visitors. Their bodies angled without discussion, one near the patient's head, one near the door, both positioned to intercept anyone who reached in fast. Still no drawn weapons. Still no threats. But the geometry was protective in a way the hospital staff did not practice. The resident leaned over the patient again. "We are losing him. BP 80 stories. Push blood," the attending ordered. "Give me another line." The float nurse's second four was already taped down, flushed, labeled. He handed the tubing over without comment, letting the resident think it had been luck. A nurse reached for the charting computer and froze. The screen blinked, then logged out. She swore softly and tried to log back in. "System is down," she said. The charge nurse looked up sharply. "No, it isn't. Pod C is charting." The nurse tried again. Same result. Selective failure again. The float nurse felt his stomach tighten. Not fear, not panic. Confirmation. Someone outside wanted the room deaf, blind, and delayed. The attending moved closer to the door and raised his voice. "You are interfering with patient care. If you force entry, you will be charged." A calm response came through the door, like someone reading policy from memory. "We have jurisdiction. You will comply. Open the door and step away from the patient." The escort near the head of the bed exhaled once through his nose, a sound that carried contempt without volume. He looked at the float nurse, just briefly, as if weighing him. "Are you trauma staff?" the escort asked. The float nurse kept his voice neutral. "I float." The escort's gaze stayed on him. "Do you know how to keep people calm?" "I know how to keep people alive," the nurse replied. "No brevado. Just a fact delivered like a medication dose." Another impact hit the door. The bolt shuddered again. Hospital security stepped forward at last, as if remembering they existed. One officer put his palm against the door, uselessly bracing it. "Stop," he called. "This is a hospital." From the other side, someone answered with patient annoyance. "Then act like one. Open up." The float nurse turned slightly, addressing the charge nurse without raising his voice. "Where's your closest controlled corridor?" he asked. She blinked, caught between the bleeding patient and the door. "What?" "A corridor with one entrance. A place you can close without trapping staff inside," he clarified. The charge nurse swallowed. "CT hallway. One access point from the ER, one from radiology, but the radiology side has a badge door." The float nurse nodded once. "Good." The attending heard and snapped. "We are not moving a bleeding patient to CT to hide." The float nurse did not argue. He looked at the monitor, then the patient's skin, then the blood-soaked dressing. He spoke like he was narrating vitals. "If they breach that door, this becomes a hostage room," he said quietly. "You will lose control of your staff. You will die anyway." The attending stared at him, offended by the certainty. "And you know that how?" The float nurse held the attending's size. He did not offer credentials. He did not posture. "I've seen what happens when people with guns enter a medical room," he said. "It is always worse than the plan." That landed harder than any resume. The charge nurse stepped closer, voice tight. "He's right. If they come in here, stop," the attending said, but the word lacked weight now. Too many variables had escaped him. The door handle rattled again, then stopped. Silence. Not relief, warning. The float nurse watched the window panel. A shape moved away from it. A pause, then a faint metallic scrape against metal. Tool on hinge. Tool on latch. Someone was choosing where to break it. The escort near the door leaned in and spoke low. "They're going to cut it." The float nurse nodded, already acting. He reached to the crash cart and pulled open the top drawer. The resident flinched. "What are you doing?" The float nurse removed a roll of silk tape, a trauma dressing, and 2 pairs of gloves. Normal supplies. Nothing that looked like a weapon. He tossed 1 pair of gloves to the new nurse, standing frozen at the edge of the bay. "Put these on," he said, calm as if assigning a routine task. Her hands shook, but she obeyed. He turned to the respiratory therapist. "If we lose lights, you stay on the airway. Do not let anyone touch your hands." The therapist stared at him. "Why will we lose lights?" "Because if I were them," the float nurse said, voice still level, "I would kill power to this room to stop you from seeing who is doing what." The charge nurse's face tightened. She believed him, not because she understood how, because he spoke like someone describing an old problem. The attending opened his mouth, then closed it. He looked at the float nurse again, properly this time, as if noticing the stillness in his posture, the way he never looked for approval before moving. The patient's eyes fluttered. His breathing hitched, then steadied under the oxygen mask. The float nurse leaned close, checking his neckline, but his words went only to the patient. "Listen," he said softly. "We're going to move you. You do not fight us. You can serve." The patient's fingers tightened around the beret pinned at his shoulder. The float nurse did not take it. He did not ask about it. He simply covered the patient's hand with the blanket so it could not be seen easily. Restraint. Protection without announcement. The escort near the head of the bed watched that gesture and gave the smallest nod, like a man accepting a silent agreement. Outside, the voice returned, closer now, louder, no longer patient. "Open the door. Now." Hospital security looked to the attending, waiting to be told what to do. The attending looked at the bolt, then at the staff, then at the float nurse, like a man realizing his authority was paper in a storm. The float nurse spoke, not loud, not commanding in tone, but people heard him anyway. "Everyone who is not essential steps back," he said. "Create space. No screaming. No sudden moves." The resident bristled. "You cannot." The charge nurse cut in, voice shaking. "Do it." They moved, because the room felt safer when the float nurse spoke, and nobody wanted to admit that. A metallic snap sounded at the hinge. The door shifted a millimeter. The float nurse's eyes stayed on that thin line of changing light. Then he reached down and quietly disengaged the floor bolt from the inside. Not to let them in, to control when the door opened, so it would not explode inward and crush a nurse, or knock a weapon loose into a crowd, or turn panic into blood. The attending saw his hand and hissed, "What are you doing?" The float nurse did not look at him. "Buying us the first second," he said. He placed his palm flat on the door, feeling the pressure building on the other side. And when the next shove came, he let the door swing, only as far as his arm allowed, catching it with controlled force, stopping it from slamming. A man in a dark jacket filled the gap, badge already raised, eyes cold and fixed on the patient. The float nurse's voice stayed calm. "This is a trauma bay," he said. "You will lower your hands. You will speak to me." The man's eyes flicked down to the nurse's badge, float pool, and a thin smile appeared, quick and dismissive. "Move," the man said. The float nurse did not move. He simply held the door with one arm and the room with his stillness. And the first confrontation began, quiet, sterile, and one mistake away from becoming irreversible. The man with the badge tried to step in like the room already belonged to him. The float nurse held the door with his forearm, not aggressive, not theatrical, just a firm barrier that did not invite negotiation. His posture said stop without saying it out loud. "This is a trauma bay," the nurse repeated evenly. "Lower your hands." The man's badge stayed up. His other hand hovered near his belt, not reaching, but placed close enough to remind everyone what power looked like when it entered a hospital. Behind him, two more figures crowded the hallway, shadows and shoulders, keeping their faces out of the window line. The angle was deliberate. It made it harder for cameras to catch full profiles. The attending physician stepped forward, tried to reclaim control. "You cannot interfere with patient care. Give me your name and agency now." The man barely glanced at him. His eyes stayed on the gurney. "We are taking him," he said. "You will cooperate." The nurse did not raise his voice. He did not announce any authority. He did something smaller, more effective. He moved his hand from the door to the wall panel beside it and pressed the call button that looked like housekeeping to anyone who did not use it. A service toggle tied into the unit's internal alert system. The overhead speakers did not blare. No dramatic alarm. But in 3 nearby corridors, subtle red indicators lit above staff doors, silent signals that meant security risk, lockdown movement, wait for direction. The charge nurse saw the lights and inhaled sharply. "What did you stay calm?" the float nurse said, eyes still on the doorway. "Do not announce it." The escorts near the patient registered the change too. They did not relax, but the way they held their shoulders shifted from cornered to supported. Someone in the building had just taken the situation seriously. The man with the badge smirked, thin and impatient. "You think a light matters? It matters, the float nurse said, because it keeps people from walking into this. He glanced behind him, taking in the room like a map. A respiratory therapist at the head of the bed. A resident on the left. The attending at the foot. 2 nurses close enough to be grabbed if the doorway turned into a funnel. He pointed once. Small gesture, no flourish. He said to the newer nurse. Step behind the supply cart. If anything happens, you do not run. You crouch. The nurse's eyes widened. What? Do it, the charge nurse snapped, and her voice trembled because she was finally admitting what the float nurse already knew. The newer nurse moved. The attending's face tightened. This is insane. We are a hospital. The float nurse nodded, as if agreeing. That is why we cannot let this turn violent. Then he did something that looked like routine nursing and was anything but. He reached to the patient's wrist, as if checking a pulse, and used the motion to subtly slide the gurney 2 inches, just enough to change the line of sight from the doorway to the patient's face. From the hall, the badge man could see the sheet, the blood, the equipment. But not the patient's eyes. Not the beret. Not the strap detail on the torn uniform. The man with the badge leaned forward, annoyed. Move the bed back. The float nurse did not comply. He turned his head slightly, addressing the man without giving him the satisfaction of full attention. I need to see your paperwork, he said. The man's smile widened. You are a nurse. I'm the nurse assigned to this patient, the float nurse replied. If you want custody, you will give legal documentation to the medical team, and you will wait until he is stable enough to move. The attending opened his mouth to argue, partly with the intruders, partly with the float nurse for speaking like that. Before he could, the float nurse added, still calm, Doctor, he is not stable. If they move him now, he arrests in the hallway. That was not an opinion. It was a medical reality stated without drama. The attending swallowed, forced to acknowledge the truth. His eyes flicked to the monitor, pressure still low, heart rate climbing, skin cold. The badge man's patience thinned. We are not asking. The float nurse finally looked directly at him. His eyes were flat, not angry, not afraid. Just assessing. You are in a controlled medical environment, the nurse said. If you raise your voice, you will trigger panic. If you touch a staff member, you will contaminate evidence and create witnesses you cannot manage. The badge man's expression changed for the first time. Microsecond surprise, quickly buried. He had expected a frightened employee, not someone who spoke like he understood operations. The escort near the patient's head watched the exchange and made a small hand motion toward the float nurse. 2 fingers, subtle, a question. Are you with us? The float nurse did not answer with a gesture. He answered with a decision. He turned to the attending and spoke loud enough for the whole room to hear, but not loud enough to be theatrical. We are moving him for imaging, he said. CT hallway. Now. The attending stared. CT will delay surgery. It buys us control, the float nurse replied. And it is medically justified. We need a clearer picture of where he is bleeding before we cut. The resident started to protest, then stopped because the logic was clean. Because it sounded like best practice, not fear. The badge man stepped forward, trying to force the issue. The float nurse shifted half a step, still not aggressive, but now directly in the path, shoulder turned to reduce target area, hands visible. Restraint, not violence. You are not taking him out of this bay, the badge man said. The float nurse's voice stayed even. Then you will have to do it in front of cameras, in front of staff, with a dying man on a gurney. He let the words sit. The badge man glanced, despite himself, at the ceiling corners again. The float nurse saw the flicker of calculation, risk, exposure, timing. Good. He needed them thinking about consequences. Behind them, in the corridor, one of the shadows shifted, repositioning to block the line of retreat. Quiet encirclement. The float nurse noticed and spoke without turning his head to the charge nurse. Get one of your aides to clear the hall. No visitors. No families in the corridor. The charge nurse hesitated. We do not have time. You do, the float nurse said, and the firmness in his tone made it feel like a promise and a warning at once. The charge nurse moved. The attending looked at the float nurse like he was seeing him for the first time. Not as spare labor, not as float, but as someone who could steer a crisis without raising his voice. The patient on the gurney tightened his grip on the hidden beret. His eyes, when they opened, tracked the float nurse, not the doctors, not the armed men. The float nurse leaned in close, pretending to adjust the oxygen mask. "We move on my count," he murmured for the patient alone. "Do not waste strength." The patient's eyelids fluttered once, an almost imperceptible agreement. At the doorway, the badge man's jaw clenched. He had come to take a man out of hospital. Instead, he found himself being forced into the hospital's rules. Forced to wait, to negotiate, to stand under lights and cameras while a float nurse calmly reorganized the battlefield into a hallway of his choosing. And as the gurney brakes released and the wheels began to roll, the float nurse felt the cost of the shift settle into his chest. He was no longer invisible. Now he was a problem. The gurney rolled out of trauma. Bay 1 like a decision you could not take back. The float nurse walked at the right rail, one hand steadying the 4-pump pole, the other near the patient's shoulder, close enough to correct a problem before it became a crisis, far enough to look like routine transport. The attending followed at the foot, jaw tight, still trying to pretend he was leading. The resident kept pace with a pressure bag in his hands. Respiratory stayed at the head with the bag valve mask ready, eyes locked on the patient's airway. 2 escorts moved like shadows, one ahead, one behind, creating a moving pocket around the gurney. And in the hallway, the badge man stepped aside just enough to let them pass. Not because he accepted it, because he was calculating. "You're making a mistake," he said, walking alongside now, too close. "You are obstructing a federal operation." The attending snapped. "This is a hospital. He is dying. If you slow us down." The badge man did not look at the attending. His attention stayed on the float nurse's hands, on the placement on the comm. "You," he said to the nurse. "What is your name?" The float nurse did not answer. He did not ignore him either. He made eye contact once, brief, neutral, and then looked back to the patient's monitor. "Blood pressure is trending down," he said to the resident, as if the question had never been asked. "Increase flow. Keep the line patent." A quiet refusal. Polite. Total. The badge man's mouth tightened. He moved ahead, signaling to one of his people with a small tilt of the head. In the distance, the CT corridor entrance sat under bright lights, too bright, too exposed. A long, straight run of floor that gave anyone standing at the far end a clear view of everything moving toward it. The float nurse did not like straight hallways. Straight meant predictable. As they approached, a hospital aide stepped out from a side corridor, pushing a linen cart, eyes down, unaware. The float nurse saw the collision before it happened. He shifted the gurney slightly left with one controlled pull, never breaking stride. The aide looked up late, startled, and froze. "Stay back," the float nurse said, calm and low. The aide backed away, confused, clutching the cart handle. The attending glanced at the nurse, as if to say, "Fine, you can anticipate carts." Then his eyes flicked to the escorts and the badge man's team, and the attending's face tightened again. This was not about carts. At the CT entrance, the radiology badge door should have clicked open for staff. It did not. The reader flashed red. The charge nurse swiped again. Red. "Are you kidding me?" she hissed, shoulders rising with panic. The float nurse leaned in, eyes on the lock. He did not touch it yet. He listened. On the far side of the door, faint movement. A shoe scuff. A breath held too long. Someone was already there. Not radiology staff. Not waiting patients. The corridor was supposed to be empty at this hour. The float nurse spoke quietly to the escort behind him. "Your rear. Watch the cross hall." The escort's eyes shifted immediately, posture tightening. He adjusted his position without making it obvious. The badge man saw the subtle coordination and smiled again. Thin, pleased in a way that did not belong in an ER. He stepped forward and held up his badge toward the reader like it was a master key. The door clicked. The float nurse's eyes flicked to the badge, just long enough to register the way it was used. Not a normal access card. Something that spoke to systems, not people. The door opened. The CT corridor beyond was too quiet. The sound of the gurney wheels entered first, echoing off stair walls. The fluorescent lights were harsher here, reflecting in long bands across the polished floor. Halfway down the corridor, a man in scrubs stood near the CT control room window. At first glance, he looked like staff. Then the float nurse saw it. The scrub top sat too stiff, like it had never been washed. The ID badge hung at the wrong height. The hands were wrong. Clean nails, no calluses, fingers too still. The man's eyes were on the gurney. Not on the patient's airway. Not on the blood. On the patient's face. The float nurse slowed by a fraction. The attending, impatient, muttered, "Move." The float nurse raised his hand slightly, a gesture that read as "hold for a second" to anyone who had ever moved a patient through a tight space. The respiratory therapist stopped without argument. The resident stopped too, grateful for any moment to recheck the pressure bag. The badge man frowned. "Keep moving." The float nurse pointed at the patient's monitor. "He is crashing. If he arrests in CT, your operation ends in a hallway." The badge man's eyes flicked to the numbers. He did not understand them, but he understood seriousness. He let the pause happen. The float nurse used that pause to speak to the attending without turning his head fully. "Doctor," he said quietly, "I need you to make a choice." The attending's voice was tight. "About what?" "About your staff," the float nurse replied. "If this becomes force, you tell them to back away. You tell them to live." The attending stared at him, offended, then frightened, because nobody said that in a hospital unless they had seen the alternative. Before the attending could answer, the man in scrubs stepped forward. "I can take him," he said. "CT is ready. Just bring him in." The float nurse looked at him. "Name?" "A beat." "Mark," the man said. "What is your last name?" the float nurse asked. "Another beat." "Too long." The float nurse nodded once, as if satisfied. Then he did something that looked like care and was control. He reached up and adjusted the patient's blanket, smoothing it over the chest and shoulder, covering the beret hand completely, hiding the strap detail, hiding any insignia. As his hand passed near the patient's neck, he pressed 2 fingers gently at the carotid pulse point, clinical, normal. But he leaned close enough for the patient to hear. "Do not speak," he murmured. "Do not give them anything." The patient's eyelids fluttered. His lips parted, and the float nurse saw the effort it took for him to obey. Then the patient's eyes shifted, past the nurse, toward the badge man. The patient's gaze sharpened for a second, like a man waking up in the wrong place. His mouth moved anyway, a reflex of command fighting shock. "Stand," he tried to say. The escort at his head stiffened. The badge man's smile vanished. The float nurse cut it off without force. He increased the oxygen flow, pressing the mask more firmly, not painful, just secure, and spoke over him, calm and clinical. "He is hypoxic," the nurse said to the room. "Do not let him talk. He will decompensate." The attending started to object, then stopped because the numbers supported it. The badge man leaned in, voice low now, dangerous. "You are interfering again." The float nurse met his eyes. "No," he said. "I am preventing you from killing him in front of witnesses." The badge man's face hardened. Behind him, the scrub man's hand moved slightly toward his waistband, hidden by the fabric. The float nurse saw it. He did not shout. He did not lunge. He simply shifted the gurneys. Half an inch, an almost invisible adjustment that forced the scrub man to step back to avoid contact. And in that small step backward, the man revealed what he could not hide, a hard outline under the scrubs at his hip. A weapon concealed. The float nurse's mind did not race. It narrowed. This was the escalation. Not gunfire. Proximity. A locked corridor. A dying commander. And people pretending to be lawful while positioning to take him. The float nurse looked at the attending again. "Now," he said softly, "tell them to back away." The attending's throat worked. His eyes moved from the weapon outline to the patient's gray face to the terrified new nurse at the rear. Then, for the first time tonight, the physician used his authority for the right thing. "Everyone except airway and blood. Step back," he ordered, voice shaking but firm. "Now." Staff obeyed. The badge man's jaw tightened. He had wanted chaos he could control. Instead, he was watching a hospital form discipline around a float nurse who refused to panic. And the cost was coming closer, because in a corridor this tight, the next move would not be words. The CT corridor felt narrower now that everyone understood what it was. A hallway with badge doors at both ends. Glass windows that turned staff into silhouettes. Bright lights that made it impossible to hide anything except intent. The attending's order had pulled most of the staff backward. The trauma team obeyed because the command sounded like medicine, not fear. But their eyes kept returning to the weapon outline under the fake scrub top, to the badgeman's calm, to the escort's controlled tension. Nobody wanted to be the first person to scream. The float nurse stayed at the gurney's right side, fingers on the fore tubing, eyes moving in short, discipline checks, patient's chest rise, monitor numbers, hands in the corridor, door lines, faces. The badgeman took one step closer. He lowered his voice, aiming it like a needle. "You are out of your depth," he told the nurse. "You are a temporary employee, a float. If this goes wrong, nobody protects you." The float nurse did not answer that. He looked at the fake scrub tech instead. The man's right hand hovered near his waistband again, as if it wanted to remember the shape under fabric. Then the float nurse spoke, not to threaten, not to negotiate, to set terms. "You have cameras," he said, nodding toward the ceiling. "You have witnesses. If you take them by force, you will have to silence a hospital. You cannot do that cleanly." The badgeman's eyes stayed cold. "You will be surprised what can be done cleanly." The float nurse believed him. That was the problem. Behind the gurney, the newer nurse made a small, involuntary sound. It was not a cry. It was the sound of someone realizing the building they trusted could be violated. The float nurse turned his head slightly toward her. His voice stayed low. "Look at me," he said. She did, eyes wet, face pale. "Breathe," he told her. "Slow. You do not move unless I tell you." It was not a motivational line. It was a stabilization measure. He was treating panic like an airway problem, something you managed early before it became catastrophic. The attending watched that interaction and looked away, ashamed of how quickly he had laughed at the word float earlier. The patient's blood pressure dipped again. The monitor tone sharpened, an insistent warning that biology did not care about badges. "BP is 70, the resident said, voice cracking. "He's going to arrest." "We need to cut," the attending said. "Now, we need an oar." The charge nurse shook her head. "Or is still not answering. Phones are down. We cannot even call anesthesia." The badgeman smiled faintly at that, as if he had expected it, as if the building had already been softened for him. The float nurse felt something heavy settle behind his ribs. They had engineered isolation. Not total blackout, just enough to remove options. And now the crisis was narrowing into one choice: surrender the patient, or resist and risk staff getting hurt in a hallway. He looked at the escorts. The one at the rear met his eyes. The escort's jaw tightened, and he made a small, almost imperceptible shake of the head, as if to say, "We cannot win a firefight here." Not with nurses behind them. Not with a bleeding commander on a gurney. The float nurse nodded once. He understood. Restraint. Not because he lacked capability, because this place was full of people who did not sign up for violence. The badgeman stepped in again, closer now. "We're done talking. Move away from the patient." The float nurse did not back up. Instead, he raised his empty hands slightly, palms open, slow, deliberate, showing the room he was not escalating. "I will move," he said calmly, "when you answer one question." The badgeman's eyes narrowed. "Speak. What is his legal status?" the float nurse asked. "Detained? Witness? Suspect? Protective custody?" "You came with a story. Choose one." For a fraction of a second, the badgeman hesitated. It was a tiny pause. But in a corridor this tense, a pause was a crack. The float nurse filled it, still calm. "Because if you're taking a patient under arrest, hospital policy requires 2 uniformed officers and documentation. If you're protective custody, it requires coordination with administration and security. If you're federal medical transport, you should have a medical officer with you." He nodded toward the fake scrub tech. "He is not a medical officer." The fake scrub tech's eyes flicked away. The attending heard it, the clean logic, the way the nurse used policy like a scalpel. For a moment, the attending looked like he might speak up. Then the badgeman made his move. Not a grab, not a strike. A step that placed his body between the gurney and the attending physician, cutting the doctor off from his own patient. It was subtle, It was domination without touching. And the attending froze, realizing he was not built for this kind of fight. The badge man leaned toward the float nurse. Last chance. Step aside. The float nurse held his gaze. Then he made the moral choice that tasted like ash. He turned his head slightly toward the charge nurse and spoke with clinical calm. "Get the staff out of this corridor," he said. The charge nurse blinked. "What about you?" "Now," he repeated. The charge nurse's throat worked. She started moving people back, respiratory first, then the newer nurse, then the resident, pulling them away like evacuating a room from smoke. The attending hesitated. "I'm not leaving my patient." The float nurse looked at him, steady, not accusing. "You will not help him if you get hurt," the float nurse said. "Back up. Keep your people alive." The attending's eyes burned, but he obeyed. He stepped back with the others, hands clenched, helpless in a way that felt unbearable. The corridor emptied until only the gurney, the two escorts, the badge man's team, and the float nurse remained in the bright, sterile line of cameras. Witnesses reduced. Risk concentrated. Cost accepted. The badge man's smile returned, satisfied. "Smart." The float nurse exhaled once. He lowered his hands and stepped half a pace away from the gurney rail, just enough to look like compliance, but not enough to abandon the patient. The patient's eyes opened then, clearer than before. Pain and shock had not left him, but command surfaced through the haze like a reflex. He looked at the float nurse. His fingers, hidden under the blanket, tightened around the beret one more time. The float nurse leaned close, as if checking the mask seal, and spoke so softly only the patient could hear. "I'm going to let him think he won," he murmured. "You stay quiet. You let me control the next minute." The patient's eyelids fluttered. A faint, almost imperceptible nod, whether consent or surrender, it was impossible to tell. The escort at the head of the bed watched the float nurse with a hard, silent respect now, as if realizing what he was doing. The badge man gestured. "Take him." The fake scrub tech stepped forward, and the float nurse did the last thing the room expected. He stepped in front of the gurney again, not to fight, to offer himself. "I will go with you," he said. The badge man paused. "Why?" "Because he will arrest if you move him wrong," the float nurse answered. "And if he dies in your custody, every camera in this building becomes your problem." He watched the badge man's eyes calculate. A nurse was not supposed to think like that. The badge man's jaw tightened. Finally, he nodded once. "Fine," he said. "You come. But you do exactly what I say." The float nurse nodded, expression empty, compliant in appearance. But inside, his mind moved with cold clarity. He had just placed himself between a dying commander and the people trying to take him. He had reduced risk to the staff by taking it onto his own body. And as the gurney wheels began to roll forward under Chu's hands, the float nurse felt the cost fully now. If he was wrong, nobody would know until after. And even if he was right, he would not be thanked. He would simply disappear back into the hospital's cracks, where float nurses lived. The gurney rolled deeper into the CT corridor under hands that were careful for the wrong reasons. The badge man walked at the left side now, close enough to control the speed, close enough.